here on the Money Corner. Tonight we're going to do a theme that we've repeated in the past, a theme about entrepreneurship, which is very, very popular in our society tonight. And we're going to look at entrepreneurship from the viewpoint of the academic world. Two of my guests are both academicians, but they're both very practical men as well. Dan Diamond is Dean of the School of Business and Public Administration at New York University. Dan, did I get it right? Both Dan and I are graduates of that school, but when we graduated, it was a School of Commerce. Today, it's a school.
I'm glad you can feel that to be
practical is also an academician. I appreciate that.
That's not a bad combination.
No, it's
and the
not.
other gentleman with Dan is really a former colleague of mine. Zenas Block, Dr. Zenas Block, is a professor of management at New York University's Graduate School of Business.
Yeah, but I don't have a doctorate, Phil.
You don't?
No.
Zenas, I always thought of you as a doctor. You're certainly a former scientist. Okay.
Well, when he sends his bill, that's the reason.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Fellas, this subject of entrepreneurship is something that you each have been involved in, but just by way of introduction in terms of our audience, carrying the audience into the discussion, it's not a new topic here on the show. I did a show on entrepreneurship featuring women who run their own businesses. Mm-hmm. I've done a subject on entrepreneurship in the black community, which I think is one type of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is a very fashionable word. I guess fashionable the way the word yuppie is fashionable today. And yet, in some ways, I guess it has a real meaning in terms of a very different kind of philosophy that we live under in terms of government and where people see their wherewithal coming from in the 80s as opposed to the social philosophies of the 60s and 70s. You may not agree with that kind of ad-libbing. But I'd like each of you very briefly to tell the audience your own involvement in this area of entrepreneurship. Dan,
Sure.
Why don't you lead off?
Yes. I've recently returned, as you know, to New York University.
Right.
And
Dan was associated with a college in Lowell, Massachusetts.
right.
Lowell.
I was at the University of Lowell, which is part of the Massachusetts public higher education system. And just prior to September of last year, for the 4 years preceding, I initiated and directed a small business development center. Our role there was to provide one-to-one counseling on a confidential basis at no cost to entrepreneurs of all kinds, of all dimensions. And during that period, our particular center, which was part of a statewide program, serviced about 1,000 clients. That is, we spoke to 1,000 people, interviewed 1,000 people. And of those 1,000 clients, I would say that perhaps 300 we helped in depth, and by that I meant we provide counseling and support services which averaged somewhat in the order of 50 to 60 hours.
Okay, Dan, let's come back to the Lowell Center and use that as a model in just a moment. Zenas, you've had a different kind of entrance into this area of entrepreneurship. You've had a very, very successful career in the business world in terms of company development, formation of capital, and now you've been a very successful entrepreneur within the business world. Now you're bringing that entrepreneurial experience to the academic world.
Yes.
And now, would you tell us a little about it?
Well, I sort of got interested in the academic side because I really was puzzled by the difference in the way that I behaved when I was in business. Between how I behaved when I was involved in starting a new business and how I behaved when I was running an old one.
Yeah. Zenas, I just want to mention for the benefit of our audience, you were one of the major executives in a corporation that ran well in excess of $100 million.
Well, we grew it from 20 million to 140 million.
You were involved in starting new ventures in Asia.
Yes.
That became very successful.
Coal Japan, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you really were involved in quotations the real world on the level of big business.
Yeah, not by today's mega standards, not multi-billion-dollar businesses, but the Japanese business started with nothing and is today about a $40 million a year business. And the English business we started, is also in the same ballpark. By today's standards, I would say it's mid-sized business, because big business today is multi-billion-dollar.
Yeah, the RCA
business,
General
Yeah,
Electric merger is
Right.
mind-boggling.
Yeah, but I've been involved in some 25 corporate business startups, not all of which were successful, and a few private business startups. But to get back to the other point, what really intrigued me was the difference between the way I behaved between operating old business activity and starting new business activity. In one case being forcing oneself to be totally rational, in the other case not having time to be totally rational and having to act on instinct, intuition, and with high speed. And I was curious to explore that further to find out if it was my schizophrenia or the nature of the beast.
Okay, so
And that's what led me into research and then into teaching.
okay, now one of the elements you're identifying, if we're going to stick with our theme of entrepreneurship, is that in this new business venture, the startup operation, by way of definition, you're really winging it. A high degree of creativity and spontaneity and responding quickly to unknowns.
You're winging
is a part
it.
of the,
You're winging it within a framework. You're not really winging it totally.
what is
'cause
the
if you
framework?
do,
What is the framework?
well, you have a concept. Dan has a lot to say about this. You have a concept of where you want to go and what you want it to be like, but the path is very uncertain, and the intermediate steps along the path and when they will occur is uncertain. But you've got to have a ball and you've got to have an eye on it, and you've got to keep driving with that eye on the ball, although the intermediate steps may turn out to be quite different. I mean, you may think that it will only cost you $250,000 to develop a product, and it's an illusion that won't last very long, because it will usually cost you much more than that. Whatever you think. Whatever you think.
Yeah, I was interested. Both of you may have seen the profile of Arthur Rock in the Wall Street Journal yesterday.
No, I didn't see it.
They talked. He pioneers high tech, as you
Yeah.
know. Someone came to him and said, "We've got an idea for a computer," and they said, "Well, we can do it for $5 million." He said, "It'll cost $10 million."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, cost
yeah,
$10 million.
okay.
But Dan, for the moment, Zenas was kind of a straight man for you because he said Dan has some.
Yeah. I think that one of the critical ingredients in successfully launching a new enterprise, and therefore in an entrepreneurial activity, is to properly define your business. Now, when you ask people about what their business goals are or what business they're in, they tend to come up with very ready answers, but that's not a question that can be easily answered.
What would the ready answer be? A person is in the hat business. They
Well,
make hats.
let me again. Let me get back to my experience at the Small Business Development Center. I think this is there are many examples, but this is a classic one. Individual would come in and say, I want to start my own business. I'm dissatisfied with my current economic situation. I've been employed with this company for X number of years. And what business are you interested in going to? Well, I'd always wanted to start a restaurant. And then you begin to ask some questions. Well, what do you know about the restaurant business? Well, I eat and I cook, and I mean, what's there to know about the restaurant business? And I say, well, tell me more about what you want to do. I mean, there are all kinds of food. There are all ways to deliver food. There are various classes of restaurants. There are various types of service that one can provide. Merely to say that you're going into the restaurant business is really just to begin. It's comparable to someone saying, well, I'd like to take a trip. Well, where do you want to go? I want to go west. Well, where west? And how do you want to get there? And what way do you want to go? And so that properly defining is often the most, I consider it to be really, if you talk about analogy of building a house, that's the foundation. A lot of people, a lot of entrepreneurs will start a venture and put a great deal of effort, a great deal of resources in it, but they don't have a proper foundation, and obviously it collapses. And that's where properly defining your goal is, and defining your business. And it's not something which can be readily answered. It takes a great deal of effort and time and careful research and expertise. One of the things I think that people misunderstand, and there's a great misapprehension here, is that the feeling is that, oh yes, anyone can start a business and be successful. Well, we know the statistics indicate that's not true. I feel that those that are successful in entrepreneurship view it as it should be viewed, as a profession, just as dentistry or medicine or engineering or accountancy. And it requires that type of discipline, that type of background and study to properly lead one not only to successfully conduct a business, but to properly define it. And of course, definitions don't remain static. They change over time. And if you don't change your business definition accordingly, then obviously you're going to get on the rocks.
You know, Dan mentions it requires writing a charter, professionalism, and study. You mentioned that the new business venture has a high degree of irrationality, which is kind of incompatible with the study and the rationalism.
I don't think so.
Well, the question is the framework as compared to the detail. You know, if you're running an ongoing business, as you know, Phil, I mean, if you have a product and a market and a history, you damn well ought to be able to predict how much product you're going to be able to sell in the following year, with what kind of margins, with what kind of pricing against known competition. You enter the market with a new product to a new market, which you're not familiar with, okay, which you may have studied to a certain degree. The uncertainty level rises tremendously. I mean, the essential difference between running an ordinary business and starting a new one is the uncertainty level involved. Now, I don't agree with everything I heard you say, Dan, about, you know, you really I keep thinking that entrepreneurship existed long before business schools and education in entrepreneurship.
Yes.
And I'm concerned that people might think that the only way to be a successful entrepreneur is you have to go to school and learn how to be an
and I
entrepreneur. And I don't think
well,
that's what you mean.
No, that isn't what I meant.
Yeah.
I think a great deal of this is not properly and can't be properly learned in a classroom or from a textbook.
Yeah, that's
I
why-
think it comes, I'm talking about experience.
Yeah, but I'm curious, and we don't have to get into it now, this is a half-hour program, but I would like to know how you two intend to, in effect, convey this in a classroom situation or in the academic setting. But that's somewhat of a digression, Zenas, from where you were at. What you were just saying, that, in effect, one of the problems, and it's almost a cliche now, people going into business frequently fail not because of lack of management or dedication, but because of lack of capital, the staying power during this whole period of unknown and uncertainty.
You know, I don't know that the data exists that really analyzes the reason for the 90% of the businesses that don't exist 5 years after they're started.
The very high failure rate.
Well, it's not necessarily failure. It's not necessarily failure. It's simply that 90% of them don't exist. Some sell out, some decide to walk away. There are 680,000 businesses started every year in the United States, and only about 90,000 bankruptcies. You know, so the rest that disappear don't disappear through filed bankruptcies.
No, they may salvage some of the assets or some of the time.
They just stop. I don't know what the point was that we're trying to.
Well, I think the point of the program really is there are people out there who, let's face it, in America, America really is a land of dreams. You know, the immigrant came to America because they visualized the streets paved with gold, and in many cases it's the grandson of the immigrant who found the gold, not the immigrant himself. But I think many people, and if I announce a program and we're going to talk about entrepreneurship, people watching say, oh boy, here is a tip or a cue in terms of how I get in a business for myself.
Yeah.
And I guess really the ideal kind of TV program is one of a how-to show. Well, here are the formulas, A, B, C, D, E. You, Dan mentioned one formula.
Let me get back to my analogy.
Very simple to state a formula. It's hard to carry it out.
Let me get back to my.
I want to do both.
My analogy of the restaurant. When I mean that properly defining a business, and I think the first step is to learn that particular area that you are selecting in a broad sense. I'm talking about gaining that knowledge and experience by going to work in a restaurant, by in effect learning.
Serving an apprenticeship on someone else's money.
Well, I mean, you certainly can be employed while you're doing it, by all means. And learning what about portion control, and learning about shrinkage, and learning about procurement, and learning about equipment vendors, and learning all the, and learning what it means to have a chef, and learning how to control employees, and doing all those things. This is what I mean by the learning process.
Yeah.
Then I think, having add that as a base, you can think in definitional terms.
Yeah. Dan, let me interrupt you for a moment. We have to pause for a public service announcement. Yeah. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a few moments to give you some more tips about business startup, entrepreneurship. We'll be back in a moment.
Where are we?
Thank you for staying with us. Let me reintroduce my guests. My guests are Dan Diamond, newly installed dean of New York University School of Business and Public Administration, and his colleague and my friend and former colleague of mine, Zenas, who was an executive in some major corporations in America, and Zenas is now a professor of management at New York University's GBA, Graduate School of Business
And he's
Administration.
also Associate Director of the Center for Entrepreneurial Studies.
That's right, and
Okay,
it's very
Associate
important to
Director.
mention that
Yes.
center.
For the Center
Yeah.
for Entrepreneurial Studies.
at the
Okay.
Schools of Business of New
Okay.
York University.
I kind of want to catch up for a moment. Dan, in the first part of the program, you said entrepreneurship, business startups, write a charter, know what your goals are, know what kind of business you want to be in, learn the route that you're taking, serve as an apprenticeship, make mistakes on someone else's time before you get into it. Zenas, you've gone into new business ventures on kind of a little different basis. We were together, we had dinner about a month ago, and I think in some cases you went into new ventures and you were kind of flying by the seat of your pants. It was interesting. For example, you got into a startup venture in cable television
Right.
some time ago.
Well, that was hardly the seat of my pants, though.
That was something that you knew after your background is food marketing, food processing, food packaging.
I didn't know a damn thing about cable television, and that's the most important thing I knew. That is, that I didn't know a damn thing about cable television.
Then how do you circumvent the lack of knowledge?
By hiring people who have the knowledge to teach you, to check your judgment, and so on. I think one of the major reasons for business failure is people don't know what they don't know and don't act to find out what it is they don't know. And
Well, then they have a degree of arrogance about them.
well, you can think of it as arrogance.
Or foolishness.
One of my pedagogic lines is one of the major causes of success is failure. One of the major causes of failure is previous success. And people who have been successful in a business they know enter a business they don't know and assume they're infallible because they've been successful, instead of having the most important kind of humility, and that is the humility of your own ignorance. So you have to go learn what you have to learn about
It's
a new
interesting. What you're
business.
saying is not all experiences are transferable.
I'm one of the people who don't believe that a manager is a manager is a manager who could do anything in any business. I don't believe that. I think you have to learn a business and you have to learn it in detail. And if you don't know a business, there are a lot of ways to learn it because there are people who know it.
One of the things about successful
And you can learn it from them. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
No, that's okay. I
Yeah.
was going to say, one of the things about successful entrepreneurs is, particularly when you get into complicated venture, they know one aspect of the business, but they also are the type of individuals who can seek and absorb information from a variety of sources and take that information in an objective sense. In other words, they don't have a predetermined point of view. When you talk about arrogance, I think it's more knowledge-seeking, and then the ability to take that knowledge and make a decision. But the successful entrepreneur is someone who will not act until they feel they have enough information. Now, again, I mean, there is a point at which obviously
Well, Dan, don't you believe that so frequently in a new startup there's a conflict between the need for more information and the need to act?
Absolutely.
And that's where the belly comes in.
Absolutely.
And
And
one of
that-
the things that distinguishes the good guys from the ones who
Of course.
don't make it are the people who don't trust their own belly and don't follow.
You've got no. Once you make a decision, you go with it. And if it's a mistake, all right, it's a mistake. You push it behind you and you move on. I mean, but this, of course, we're getting into now those characteristics of some entrepreneurs, because there is no single homogeneous entrepreneurial category that make for success.
Both of you as teachers or as academicians or as professionals, I think, have a mission. It's my own interpretation now, it's subjective. Have a mission to try and be mentors and convey the successful experiences you've had and really help other people sprout on their own and create a business venture. Now, Zenas, what is your methodology for this? Given a group of students or given a group of people that will work with you, what are you going to try to convey to them? How are you going to take them and they're novice on day one and hopefully get them to the point where they're into a venture which both starts up and succeeds?
Well, first of all, I think there's a certain self-selection process that takes place among the students themselves who elect to take a course in entrepreneurship. There are people who have some kind of predisposition to it, to begin with. So you have a very fertile group of minds. of people who believe. I usually ask my class at the first session, how many of you think are going to own your own business someday? And they all raise their hand.
Okay.
How many of you want to? And they all raise their hands. And how many think you will? And maybe 95% raise their hands. You know.
Is there a textbook for your course?
Yeah, there's a textbook
What is
I'm
the textbook?
using now. Well, it's a case book. I use case teaching in one of my courses for independent startups, and you know, I teach 16 cases during the semester.
And these are companies that have made it, have gone through
Not
the
necessarily. The
There's some failure
the cases are not pieces of journalism.
Yeah, and by the way, how were the cases documented? Where did the cases
Well,
come
the cases were written by case writers at a variety of universities. You know, and I mean, I'm going to teach 2 cases tomorrow on bankruptcy. Okay.
Successful bankruptcy and unsuccessful bankruptcy?
Well, yes.
Because we've had both in this
no,
country.
in one case involves whether or not to go bankrupt. All the cases end with who comes out, the lady or the tiger. You know, the students really have to identify the issues and supply the solutions, and that's the point of case teaching. The other case, the case of a young friend of mine who went bankrupt and built a phoenix out of the ashes, and he's coming. And the student's going to have an opportunity to ask him directly about his experiences and even talk about the ethics of what he did, which happens to be a very important issue I think students have to face. So that in the Patterns of Entrepreneurship course, which is a 100% case course, students learn 3 ways. Number 1, they learn from working on the cases. Number 2, they have assigned reading. Substantive stuff, you know. I mean, how do you go public? What are the legal forms of business organization? What are the advantages and disadvantages of each? I'm talking about knowledge stuff, right? And the third thing is whatever I can throw in that can crystallize something that might make it more emphatic than it would be just from reading the cases, and how I conduct the case discussion. In the other course on corporate entrepreneurship, I use cases, but there is a more structured framework to it because there is a body of theory, one might call it, that serves as a framework. My overall objective really is to get students to think differently about the world around them, to think as opportunity seekers rather than resource protectors. That's the overall objective.
Dan, Will, in the undergraduate school of business at NYU, New York University, you're the dean, and you're going to introduce new studies in the future. Will this entrepreneurial area be introduced in the curriculum? For example, Zenas talked about methodology and how to go public and things like that, and the thought occurred to me, the trials and tribulations of raising capital, and is a
hot
whole
subject.
Yeah, it's a science in itself.
And the answer to entering into the curriculum, undergraduate curriculum is yes, definitely so. The school has a history of producing extremely successful entrepreneurs. And
that's true, but that might relate to Zenas's comment on pre-selection.
Well, but again,
personality types.
True, but also it's an environment which engenders it. I mean,
right.
that makes it possible for those characteristics to be nurtured and to develop and to grow and to be supported. And one of the things that I would like to do is to sort of change the focus, or at least make it a more multi-focus. Because, as you know, New York University Schools of Business, and the undergraduate school certainly is so, is one of the top-rated schools in the country. We're attracting the very best students from the region, and they tend to be primarily focused into what are the glamour positions, whether it be with the Big 8 or whether it be with the large financial investment houses. And I want to make sure that they know that there are very rich and exceedingly rewarding opportunities in the entrepreneurial area as well. And so therefore I think it's very important that entrepreneurship have a role to play, a structured role to play in the curriculum. And I want to do my best to encourage that. Now, one way in which we are doing is to bring to the university, through a group of executive lecture series. This spring, for example, we are scheduling 7 or 8 executive lecture series. We are bringing back alumni of New York University who are successful entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs. The intrapreneur, of course, is the individual who does entrepreneurial activity within the framework of a larger organization. And obviously there are different characteristics. Obviously the problem of a capital is not not as great.
Yeah.
There are support services, and
Yeah.
the risks are different in the sense that you are not risking so much your personal wealth as you are risking your position within the organization. And we have extremely excellent illustrations. In fact, if I had the students and the time, I could have almost for the entire spring semester, I could have someone every day who is an alumnus of the school who have shown the ability to be successful entrepreneurs in various industries and various modes. And I think the important thing is to convey to the students that there's a very real opportunity there. I firmly believe, and this is on the basis of working with entrepreneurs very closely, and I think it's important to recognize that this role I played as director certainly was within an academic community. I think that's why it was successful. We had resources that we could draw on at little or no cost. But in effect, I viewed myself and our staff as well as really working with those firms. We were not academicians in the classic sense. We, in effect, became their staff in whether it be in financial aspects, whether it meant in terms of organizational structure, whether it was in terms of marketing planning, or whether it was product development. We, in effect, viewed ourselves, and that's why I think we were successful, as members of those firms. So that I had the opportunity, and I think it's an extremely exciting opportunity, to work very closely with some 300 nascent business organizations. And I viewed myself as an integral part of their organization, and therefore I viewed their success as my success and their failure as our failure.
You know, it's interesting as I listen to you both talk. I think and I alluded at the beginning of the program to the climate of the 60s and the 70s. I think people going out after the MBA 15 years ago and 10 years ago were aiming at the large corporation, making it within management. And you look at America today, particularly with the new immigrant populations that we have, the influx of the Asian people, and how vital many of them are, who are outside of the culture, the mainstream culture, how vital they are in an entrepreneurial setting. In many cases, they're fighting a language problem. They're fighting the lack of the marketplace, the ins and outs. They have marketplace in their native land. And in some ways, I told you we did several shows on entrepreneurship here on the Money Corner. Frequently you find it within women's groups, networking, and the women have how-to in terms of the entrepreneurial spirit. So you've got two things. In some sense, you find a lot of people get frustrated in the corporate world, that rigid hierarchy, working your way through it. And on the some people have the desire because they see the big golden dollar at the end of the quest. But then some people have to be the entrepreneur because they can't make it in the mainstream culture for a whole variety of reasons.
It's important, and I think it's hard to find absolutes, but I think all the evidence indicates that the successful entrepreneurs and those who really flourish in it don't do it primarily for the money, don't do it for monetary.
But more the sense of adventure.
The sense of accomplishment, the sense of being able to control their environment, their economic environment, their personal lives. And there is a major difference, as you know. I mean, obviously you do this program because you enjoy it.
Absolutely.
As opposed to being required to do something because someone tells you. And the motivation is the critical thing, and the control and the feeling of satisfaction.
We've reached the end of the line. My guest tonight has been Zenas Block, who's professor of management at New York Graduate School of Business, and Dan Diamond, who recently was installed as Dean of the Undergraduate School of Business at New York University. Fellows, thanks very much for coming. I really appreciate you taking the time out, and I'll see you here on the Money Corner soon again. Good night.